Today we have with us Sasi Kiran M, Mallam, and he will be speaking on poems in a political economy book, engaging with vernacular articulations of modernity in the late colonial Madras Presidency. He submitted his PhD thesis on Telugu print cultures in December 2019 at the department and is currently a research associate for the ICSSR-IMPRESS project on folk media and identity construction at the Humanities and Social Sciences Department of IIT Tirupati. Hello, Shashi. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Devina. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'd like to start by thanking the Department of Communication for giving this opportunity to present my research. So, this paper was first presented at the annual Sharp Book History Conference in 2018. In the process of writing the paper and further close reading of the sources, it has led me into different directions, and I've revised the paper quite a bit, and it's still a work in progress. So any comments are welcome. It will help me further develop the paper. And owing to time constraints, I'm skipping a few portions of the paper, and I'll try to focus on parts that actually inform the essence of the paper. So if any parts of the paper seems a bit incoherent, please let me know in the Q&A. I'll try to elaborate further. So the book that I'm focusing on in this particular paper is a political economy book with special reference to Indian conditions. There are two volumes of this book. What I'm showing on the screen is the first part's cover page. So it was authored by Cattamanchi Ramalinga Reddy. So he was the fellow of the Madras University at that point in time, and he had also authored a few books by then. And it was published by Vignan Chandrika Mandali in 1913. So what you see on the right side is actually the Telugu cover page. This is a catalogue of records which is prepared by the Registrar of Books. It basically gives information on how many volumes are published. So it is basically described as a textbook of political economy with special reference to Indian conditions. So that is the classification. It's classified as a textbook. And there were 5,000 copies that were printed at that point in time. So before I go further, I just wanted to clarify two things. What do I mean by poems? And after that, I'll try to address what do I mean by political economy in the context of the book. So for a moment, I'll just stop my screen sharing and I'll open the PDF file. Just excuse me for a while there. So I'll just try to explain what do I mean by poems. There are a few different types of poems that we see in the book. So the first one is that we see here is basically don't really worry about the text. I'm just trying to focus on the form of the book. So this first verse that we see here is from Mahabharata, and it tries to set a context for the book. I'll get to the other poems. So this is the introduction, and then so this is a dedication page. Now the dedication pages have a history also. So earlier the dedication pages used to be meant for patrons. So whoever is the patron of the work, so it could be kings. Most of the time it was kings who were patrons of work. So it will be the kings to whom the book is dedicated. Now in this particular case, the book is actually dedicated to an unknown person. So the author doesn't really mention whom it is dedicated to. So some of the biographers actually speculate that it is somebody who's it is written after the demise of somebody, and the author is actually lamenting that loss in this poem. So it's quite a long poem, and it's also mysterious in the sense that a lot of biographers of Cattamanchi tried to figure out who that person is, but then they just speculated. So this particular these two poems again are trying to appreciate the political economy subject itself. So they basically deal with the themes of critical thinking and also knowledge. So, so these are different ways in which poems were used in the book, and I'll come to the main part where. So, if you get to the actual text of the book, so at many places we see that the author first introduces a verse and then tries to talk about the verse while explaining some economics concept. So I'll again go back to the PowerPoint. So those are the different kinds of poems that are there in the book, and so again, as an example, so this is how the other poems in the book are located. So there is a verse, mostly from Mahabharata, and then it goes on to explain the economics concept of that particular chapter. And the second part is what is the political economy that we are talking about here. So uh, from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, or at least till John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, what we now call economics was in fact generally referred to as political economy. So what we are talking about is not political economy in the way in the way we understand it now, but it is basically political economy means just economics when the book was actually authored. So, so I'm trying to broadly understand or find answers for these three questions. So, the first one is, what are the possible reasons for the choice of the form of the book, and how do the poems frame the subject matter of the book, and where can one possibly situate the book? So, these are the three questions that I'll be looking at. So, in terms of methodology, I tried to follow a mix and match of different approaches. So primarily, I tried to follow a print culture, book history approach in terms of trying to understand uh, what are the number of copies, the authorship of the book, these kinds of things. And then I also used a biographical approach to find out a lot of details about the author. And I also had to delve into a bit of history of social movements, which again I'll discuss in the course of the presentation. And I also read some literature on the Hindu Dharma Shastras, which the author delves into in the book. I also read a bit of economics in the sense that Max Weber actually there's a small work. There's a small portion of his work which actually deals with religion, and he talks about caste and Hinduism and the resultant economic consequences of it. So I referred to those works also. So the sources were basically biographical, literary, and a few papers on Indian economic thought, papers on the non-Brahmin movement, and a few works on Hinduism. So coming back to the question of why is poetry so important that it finds a place in a modern prose work. So so Belcheru and Schulman, in an introduction to one of their works, they mention that poetry is taken seriously. It is memorized, recited, and quoted in conversations. For centuries, Telugu poetry has been closely textured by orality. Poems are read aloud, sung, and performed. To be called a poet is an honor in this society. So that was the sort of milieu in which C.R. Reddy was operating. So coming back to the Mahabharata, from which a majority of the verses are actually quoted. So what is the author's approach to Mahabharata that I'll discuss in a while. So Mahabharata was actually called as a Dharma Grantha, a book on ethics by Mahatma Gandhi. And there's a lot of literature on how he used Mahabharata to make sense of a lot of events that were happening at that point in time. He has written a few articles on the Mahabharata, and it was very much a part of the oral traditions in Telugu. It was a part of curriculum in schools where verses were supposed to be memorized by students. And like this is an entry from the Register of Books again, where it is a book called Arya Sukti Muktavali. It's a collection of moral stanzas culled from the Telugu Mahabharata. and it was edited by Apparao. And basically, so these were the kinds of books that were there. It was treated as a moral, a book on ethics and morals. And the author Cattamanchi, what was his approach to it? Before delving into that, I'll briefly talk about his background. So his school education was in Chittoor and then in the Madras Christian College in Chennai. And then he went on a scholarship to Cambridge, where he did an MA in history. And then he was also a very active part of the Cambridge Majlis there, and he was a part of the oratory clubs and debate clubs there, and he was in close touch with John Maynard Keynes and other contemporaries of his time. And after coming back, he worked with the Maharaja's College in Mysore as a professor of history. He authored this book when he was actually professor of history at Maharaja's College in Mysore. And then he was the first vice chancellor of Andhra University. That is a brief background of the author. So now Cattamanchi's approach to Mahabharata. So in the very first chapter of the book, he notes that Hindu epics or Dharma Shastras are like thousand-headed serpents. He says their moral positions are not consistent, and more often than not, they're self-serving and convenient. So he advocates caution and criticism when one is approaching or using these texts. And he, in a lot of his biographies and also his own personal writings, we get to know that the Mahabharata was very much a part of his life, in the sense that it was a part of his. So he mentions an anecdote from his childhood where the family and a few other elders from the village will sit down, and most of them, he says, are very literate, but they could memorize verses from the Mahabharata. They would pick up a few verses and then sit and discuss and debate them after dinner. So that's what he says. He calls it a family tradition. And then he says it's also a personal favorite at many points in his career. Even in Andhra University, he keeps coming back to the fact that one has to kind of look at Mahabharata as an educational resource also. So he also wrote a small verse on the Mahabharata, which translates as that the Telugu Mahabharata is a book, or he calls it the first book on earth that is without parallel in subject matter and style, in depth of thought and the subtlety of characterization. Now, while he is always critical of the contents of the book, he is always appreciative of the stylistic substance of the Mahabharata. He's mostly talking not about the Sanskrit Mahabharata, but the Telugu Mahabharata authored by the poet Triumvirate. So what I'll try to do in the next few minutes is I'll try to pick up one particular portion of a chapter, and I'll try to look at how he has used the verses and to kind of talk about a few concepts in economics. So how is he trying to link economics with the poems or verses which are there in Mahabharata? So I'll try to translate the first verse. So the verse 1 roughly translates as, after leaving his body, the human being embodies another birth with his fair share of happiness and sorrow in proportion with his karma, and the cycle of birth and death continues. So that's what the first verse means. The second verse basically translates as, if one does if one constantly does good deeds, they'll be blessed with a birth in the Devaloka. If one does a mix of good and bad deeds, they'll be blessed with a human birth. If one only does bad deeds, they'll be reborn as animals or insects. So in this manner, a human being is caught up in the ocean of hallucination and will never reach the shore. So he quotes these verses, and then he directly tries to link this with caste and upward mobility. So the 16th chapter of this book deals with the concept of labor. In a section titled An Inquiry into the Nature of Work, Cattamanchi engages with the elephant in the room, caste. So the only other Indian at that point in time, the only other Indian who also wrote about the importance of caste when talking about economics is Ranade. So there is this famous quote where he says the family and caste are more powerful than the individual in determining his position in life. Now, coming back to Cattamanchi's chapter, now Cattamanchi goes on to say, quote, They say Shudras have to dedicate themselves in the service of Dvijas, and they say the Panchama Varnas have to live as if the entire world is hell. They say except Brahmins and Kshatriyas, who are the minority, others must not achieve upward mobility. If they try it, it's a big sin. So these dharmas exposed by these verses become nooses for Shudras and Panchamas. And he concludes that these dharmas are only created for the benefit of certain castes. And he goes on to say again, what all this means is, oh, unfortunate people, die in the service of us. Even if you are poor, you need not worry, your good deeds won't go unanswered. It will help you in your next birth. You will get back whatever you are putting in your hands with interest. He further questions what is the use of implementing such a dharma that does not contribute to the greater good of everyone and does not result in any kind of freedom. So then he goes on to talk about the freedom of choice for the laborer. So he says in such a system, there is no choice for the laborer in terms of choosing work. And as a result of that, he says there will be no equality. And he says that doesn't count as any progress, either socially or economically. So his entire point is about caste and its influence on upward mobility and its influence on economics. So that is the context in which he's using these two verses. So I'll try to briefly quote from another work on Dharma Shastra, which just to set a proper context. So Mahabharata is full of a lot of subplots or small tales which go back to talking about the karma theory, and so using this while he's using this verse, he's trying to allude to all of them in the epic. He's using these two specifically at that point in time because they relate well with the nature of the work. So I'll just read a small story from Mahabharata, which again talks about a similar point. So this is from the Oxford History of Hinduism. So a new history of Dharma Shastra. So I'm just reading out a small episode from Mahabharata. I'm quoting from the book. So one episode from the Mahabharata is especially telling. During the long instruction on Dharma, the king Yudhishthira receives after the war from the dying Bhishma. Yudhishthira asks the controversial question about how persons from the three lower castes can attain the same status as Brahmins. Now, the answer he receives is that this status is unobtainable for these classes because it is the highest stage of the whole of creation. Only through innumerable births may people from the lower castes hope to be born one day in the Brahmin class. So this is another episode. There are numerous such episodes which are present in the Mahabharata that form that the author is actually trying to allude to. It's not just this one particular verse. And the other point here is these verses and these ideas can also be looked at as an early articulation of the ideas behind the non-Brahmin movement, of which C.R. Reddy would become a part in his later years. So now I'll try to give a brief background of the belief system of the non-Brahmin movement in India. Again, I'm quoting from Uma Ramaswamy's work. So in her paper on the non-Brahmin movement in the Andhra case, she talks about the non-Brahmin movement and how it rested on a few basic ideas which emerged from the writings and pronouncements of its leaders. The leaders first questioned the sanctity of the sacred texts. These were argued to be the creation of the Brahmins for the purpose of vesting themselves with ritual exclusiveness and keeping the Shudras in perpetual servility. Through the karma theory, the Brahmins rationalized their own superior position as well as the lowly status of the Shudras. So the Hindu theodicy of suffering was considered the opium of the credulous masses. So that is what Uma Ramaswamy has to say about the non-Brahmin movement and its reliance on the criticism of sacred texts of Hinduism. So that is also another context for these verses. So this is one part of the story. The other thing that was happening was all the English educated upper caste and middle class intellectuals of the time were also grappling with nationalism, and also they were also negotiating with modernity. So the Swadeshi movement led to the emergence of the idea of national education. So Sanjay Seth observes that the ideal of national education and the establishment of schools like DAV, the Aligarh Muslim University, and the Banaras Hindu University were self-conscious efforts to provide religious communities an education that would equip them with the modern knowledge necessary to face the colonial world, as well as instruction in their cultural and religious tradition. So there was a conscious effort to preserve difference while still being modern, what could be termed as the national modern, as Sanjay Seth describes it, or as the vernacular modern. Now, C.R. Reddy firmly believed in education through the mother tongue, and at the time there were very few books to facilitate that process. Now, this book on political economy was published to serve the needs of students. The constant reference to verses from Mahabharata and other verses also seems to serve the purpose of preserving difference, even when learning a purely Western subject like political economy. And I'd also like to briefly dwell on what are the uh, objectives of this book. So, in the preface of the book, the author discusses three different objectives. One is to make up for the lack of books in Telugu on political economy, as students are only aware of examples from foreign countries while they're reading other economics books. The second objective was to compare the differences between the Western nations and India in terms of economics. And the third objective was, since political economy is interdisciplinary, one needs to be introduced to the basic concepts in allied areas of the subject, by which the author means looking at the indigenous concepts of Dharma Shastra and also the karma theory and all these other concepts that he's trying to weave along with the economic concepts, or set an Indian context basically. And the author also mentions at the outset that he did not, while he did refer to Manusmriti, Chanakya's Arthashastra, he couldn't find a lot of use from those books. And he says he's primarily inspired by John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy. And I tried to compare John Stuart Mill's Political Economy with this book in terms of structure. So we can see there are certain similarities at a few places in terms of the basic structure, but then the content is completely different. Now, I'll try to conclude. I think I have 5 more minutes. Now, I'm trying to go back to the questions that we started out with. So, what are the possible reasons for the choice of the form of the book? I think one reason is, like I mentioned, while they were trying to negotiate modernity, they also wanted to preserve the difference while still ensuring that they're conveying what the Western knowledge has to say about that particular subject. And well, that is one possible reason for the choice. And the other possible reason is that Cattamanchi was trying to project himself as a modernist, and parts of the book are direct critique of the Dharma Shastras and the Manusmriti and the Mahabharata itself. So basically, by using verses from a sacred text like Mahabharata, he is also trying to critique tradition, and he is trying to introduce some kind of critical thought, which was practically non-existent at that point in time. Because Mahabharata was deemed to be a text which could do no wrong. So that was the frame in which he was operating. So that is one possible reason for the choice of the form of the book. So one is preserving the difference, and also the second one is trying to critique the source of the tradition. And the second question is, how do the poems frame the subject matter of the book? So the form of the poem stands as a remnant of the literary tradition, and the allusions of this remnant are criticized by the modern author. Now, in a way, the poem frames the entire work here. So, the entire political economy work of Cattamanchi, the poems are in a way framing the subject matter of the book. Now, if one way to kind of understand that is, like, if we remove the poems from the book, it becomes like any other book that came during that time. There are two other Telugu economic books that came around the same time after 2 or 3 years of. There was one book that came in 1918, Now, those books don't have any poems. They directly delve into economics, and most of them are direct translations of the English economics books. So there is no Indian context that is given, or there is no debate on any matters related to caste or the Dharma Shastras of Hinduism. So in terms of the answer for that, the poems actually are framing the entire book. And where can one possibly situate the book? So there are a lot of places in which the book can be situated. So if you from what I understood in terms of looking at different genres of book that were existing back then, it can be situated primarily in the tradition of modern vernacular prose books on economics. There were a handful of books, so this can be situated primarily there. And it can also be called as a polemic on the caste system. So the tone is very polemical in that sense. And it could also be situated in hindsight in the history of Indian social and economic thought, which actually doesn't recognize this work as being belonging to that particular segment. And it could also be a critique of the Hindu Dharma Shastra, an early critique of the Hindu Dharma Shastra. And a disclaimer towards the end of the presentation is that the idea is not to present a binary view of Cattamanchi. He was a man full of contradictions. He was also, just to give an example, Cattamanchi was also one of the many Telugu literati who vehemently opposed the erotic literature of the Prabandhas and ensured that they are not prescribed as texts for intermediate students. He also went to the extent of rewriting the erotic portions of the work Bilhaniyamu as Navayamini. So this contradiction in several stances taken by intellectuals of this time were only a reflection of the times they lived in, and there was an onslaught of Western epistemological frames onto the indigenously located and acquired knowledge. And Belcher Narayan Rao actually attributes this disdain for erotic literature to the Victorian morality that was imbibed as a result of colonial modernity. So yeah, I think I'm at the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions, I think I'll take them now.
Thank you so much, Shashi. Your presentation engaged with transitional dynamics of Telugu print cultures of the late colonial period, just as we are seeing some interesting transitions of our own in the current situation. So we'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB live comment questions towards the end of the meeting, Shashi. I now request participants to please raise their hands. It's a little icon next to your username, and I will announce your names in order. If you can't raise your hand, please let me know that you would like to ask a question via personal message in the Zoom chat here. Kindly turn on your microphone and or video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. Please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction. And we will take questions starting now for the next 10 minutes only to manage time better. We already have a few questions. Okay, so Vinod sir has the first question.
Yes, sir.
Sashi, thank you for that fascinating presentation. I mean, using poems in a political economy book. Wow, I mean, this is a kind of a literary device used by Cattamanchi. It is sort of an academic device that we don't see very often in literature on subjects like economics and so on. So it was very fascinating. My question is methodological. Not just on this slice of your larger work that you presented, but about the larger work that you're doing, that you have done already on print culture, Telugu print culture. So I see, for example, your work as encompassing the history of Telugu print culture. It also is sort of a sociology of literature. it also moves to sort of a literary textual analysis at points. So in terms of methodology, for all the scholars who are here for the talk today and others, please take us through the kind of methodological toolkit that you have put together to do your larger work.
Yes, sir. So the methodology part was from the beginning of my thesis. It was very daunting in the sense that print culture, by definition, is interdisciplinary in nature, because there is nothing that one can achieve just by going through catalogs, which is primarily the which a lot of book historians actually delve into. So what I've tried to do in my thesis and also in this particular work is I tried to look at following 2 or 3 different approaches. One is obviously, like you noted, a textual analysis. So where I'm delving into both the form and content of the works that I'm looking at, and the frame in which my thesis and also this particular work, which is a tangent to my thesis, is basically the larger question or the larger interest of mine is in understanding modernity. And now my subject position is basically of that of a Telugu person, Telugu being my mother tongue. So in a way, it is also to understand what is Telugu modernity, if you were to put it like that. So one way is trying to follow the methodology of cultural history, of which book history is a smaller part. And so that is one thing that I've been trying to do. And also I've been trying to look at textual analysis, and also trying to look at, there is this one particular methodological intervention in book history, which some historians have tried to point out. It is slightly confusing because they use the word mediation, but this is not the mediation that we generally speak of in media. So this mediation is basically where they try to talk about understanding how a particular book mediated in the larger culture of the times, or the larger socio-economic, political, cultural situation of the times, which the term as mediation. So that has been one point of departure methodologically for me in looking at the Vijnana Chandrika Mandali, of which my thesis is a part of. A large part of the thesis is about Vijnana Chandrika Mandali. So where again I'm trying to look at the text and the context, if I were to put it very simply. And there were a lot of issues in terms of methodology, even in the SHARP conference where I presented this paper. So I had a similar discussion where a few book history scholars there said that they were also going in a direction where they're trying to slightly move away from the book and also look at the context.
Yeah.
I hope that answers.
Yeah. I mean, we can go on talking about this, but I understand what you're saying. Thanks. Yeah.
All right, great. Next we have Thirumal sir. If you could please come online.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Hi, Sashi. Every time I listen to a presentation, it gets finer and finer. And I think this is one of the very good presentations of yours that I've heard. The question that Vinod is asking, and in a slightly different way, when we study book history, one of the things that we're talking about is form. But forms are something that doesn't exist in isolation. The book as a form has something like a manuscript. It has something like palm leaves. It has something like, I mean, there is a whole lot of media that it represents, and a whole lot of content that it remediates. Okay, now if it remediates a whole lot of content, and if it remediates a whole lot of forms in some ways, I mean, the medium itself, then the way we understand book history in India cannot be the way we understand book history by Robert Darnton or any of these book historians. We need a very different way of situating the medium and situating the content of the book. So in that sense, I was wondering if you have some insights into how you would think the form of the book itself is an accretion of certain other forms that are already there, and is an accretion of certain kinds of content which is already there. And that is one of the reasons why it is so difficult, perhaps, to demarcate what is prose and poetry in the Indian context, and or demarcate the disciplines as well, because the disciplinary demarcations are also very modern demarcations. So this book represents a certain modernity which seems to borrow heavily from different traditions. And so the kinds of, what is interesting about your work, I think, is you're bringing in some ingenious way of looking at how these things get mixed up in some ways. Can you throw some more light on that?
So while I was trying to think of a title for the presentation, this is different from the actual title that I used. So I named it as engaging with these articulations, because primarily I was confused myself as to what are the ways in which I can engage with this particular articulation of modernity. So as I was trying to understand, as I was going through the text itself, so it kind of threw back a few ways of looking at it. Because, for example, if we take the, I kind of skipped that part because of the time. So there is, in the preface, so the author actually collaborates with another scholar, Rallapalli Anantakrishna Sharma, so who has been a long-time friend and collaborator. So what they do is, he writes a small poem for him in the preface. Now, which is a tradition that is there in a lot of other books. We also notice that. Now, if we go to Anantakrishna Sharma's books, so there is one particular book called Gada Saptasati, where he is writing a poem for Cattamanchi.
Yeah.
So there is this particular tradition in the book where in between the authors there is an exchange of verses in the larger universe of their books.
Yeah.
And go on, then he's also using the verses to express a very personal grief.
Okay.
So the 10-verse poem that I refer to, it's a very poignant poem about the death of a loved one, and whom the author is still missing. And it is also, it doesn't appear off the cuff. It is very elaborately written and very beautifully written. So now that is also, again, that kind of forced me to look at his biography, and where is that poem coming from, and what is the tradition from which that is coming from. And then stepping into the book itself, now the verses, initially I thought the verses are being written, but then I realized as I was reading that the verses are not being written, but they were actually being memorized, because in his school days he was actually kind of forced to memorize all these poems which he loved. So now, as he's writing the economics concepts, the poems are coming naturally to him from his memory, and he's jotting them down. So that is another thing. So it's a mixture of the oral tradition from his school,
Right.
and what all other traditions he has imbibed over the course of his career as an educator, and also he's also a literary critic. So he authored a book, one of the early Telugu literary critic books called Kavitva Tattva Vicharamu.
Yeah.
He's also using a bit of what he learned there in this particular book. So it's a mix and match of the oral traditions and the traditions that are there already in poetry at that point in time, and the prose that they have to now use because of modernity.
Yeah.
Now he's writing a textbook, and he cannot actually write a textbook in complete verse.
Yeah.
Because they are claiming that this publishing house is a modern publishing house and they have to publish prose books. That's the mandate he has. But still, he somehow manages to put poems into it, and it also serves the larger purpose of what he is trying to say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Usha ma'am. She has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Sasi, for the presentation. I mean, a lot of rich material there. So my question sort of, I guess, follows on from the previous two. So this is kind of, you've touched on questions of form, content, context, and if you think about poetry as a form, it's necessarily ambiguous. Whereas this, both in terms of the science of economics, which tends towards certainty, and the form of the textbook, which further, attempts to fix ideas. I mean, there's a tension there, right? Even within the book that you're looking at. So, one, methodologically, as you're reading, how do you keep shifting between the way you read the poetry part of the book and the prose? One, and secondly, do you have any sense of the editorial dynamics when the book was submitted as a manuscript? What the process was? Was there any negotiation there, and so on?
So I'll answer the last question first, ma'am. So in terms of the editorial, what happened in the editorial process, we don't have any actual letters or correspondence between the editor and the author, but there is a note by the editor, which again is not indicative of the process of what was happening in the editorial. And from the sense that I get, the book was not edited in the traditional way in which books were edited, or the traditional sense a book is edited, because I was able to notice a lot of let's say a few mistakes here and there. So those kinds of things cropped up, and also the style of the author was also not reined in by the editor in that sense, because the style varies from reverence to a particular a verse or a poet to completely a polemical tone, and then to instructional tone. So then there are graphs in the book which explain a few things. So that way, editorially, I don't think it was done in the traditional way. And the first question of how does one engage with the poems and the prose. Now, the poems, I'm not trained in that sense to kind of read Telugu poetry and understand it the way it is understood by a poet, or the way it is understood by a literary critique of Telugu poetry. But what I try to do in my limited capacity is I'm trying to understand Telugu poetry by reading other sources. But what I primarily try to do is I try to go with the meaning of the verse, and most of these verses, there are commentaries available for these poems because they are from Mahabharata. There are different commentaries available, and I refer to those commentaries, and so a certain ambiguity is kind of lost there, because I am actually directly referring to the secondary reading of the meaning of the poem. And when it comes to prose, the prose is also written in what was then called as Sarala Granthika, which was a negotiation between the literary style and the vernacular style. They tried to achieve a middle ground, and so that students also can understand it. But it's still very archaic that way. Like a modern Telugu reader who's only reading newspapers will not be able to kind of understand it, because it takes me 3 or 4 readings to at least grasp what is happening even in the prose. So I'm still in a very preliminary stage in terms of acquiring the entire skill set required to understand it better.
Right, thank you. So we are now moving towards the Zoom chat and Facebook comment questions. And the first question is, I'm also posting it in the Zoom chat for you to see.
Yeah,
The first question is by...
So Janna was asking, can you please briefly tell about the history of social movements? So I referred primarily to the literature around the non-Brahmin movement and the one particular quote that I used was from Umar Ramaswamy's work on non-Brahmin movement, and there are also a few other sources on the Justice Party that came in after the non-Brahmin movement was a precursor to the formation of Justice Party. So those were a few things that I referred to. The non-Brahmin movement is particularly important in the context of this book because the initial articulation of the ideas that led to that, we can see them here taking shape in this particular book by Cattamanchi. In terms of that, those were the only two sources that I referred to. And if you need any more information, I can maybe provide it to you online in terms of the sources. I've uploaded a few in the Google Drive link that was shared by Devina.
Yeah, I'll just share that with everyone. We have another question from Facebook. I'm just sharing it on chat here. It's by Supriya Sukumari, who's a producer with EMMRC IFLU. And she's asking about the relevance of, how relevant is Kautilya's Artha Shastra to Cattamanchi?
So, as I was mentioning towards the end of the presentation, he mentions Kautilya's Artha Shastra as one of the books that he referred to in the process of writing this book on political economy, but he's kind of dismissive towards the sources that he found or the content that he found, and I think I'll try to quote him. Just give me a second from the book itself. So he basically says that he could not find anything that is directly useful for this particular work. So that is what he has to say about Kautilya's Artha Shastra. And the book is basically it's meant to be an Indian rendition of Principles of Political Economy by John Stuart Mill. So that's the overall mandate, I think. So that's why he didn't venture much into the other sources. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. I'm just going to post another question by Sujata. So S. Sujata is from Hyderabad, and I think she graduated from Osmania. And she's mentioning that change is imminent. So hasn't Cattamanchi sort of followed the textuality of Mahabharata in a sense? Did you get the question, Shashi?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand it. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought my internet connection is not the best.
I'm just trying to. Yeah, so I think if the question means whether followed in this textuality too, the question of change is dealt with in the book a couple of times, where the author tries to talk about what does change mean and what does progress mean. But then he looks at Mahabharata as a static text that is there, and given the importance that it holds in the larger religious framework and the moral ethical discourse that is there at that point in time, so he treats it as a static text, and he also tries to differentiate between history and myth. And in one of the speeches that he gives later on, he says the only reason why it was translated into Telugu was also to propagate Brahmanism. So that is his whole idea on the book. Though he's very, very appreciative of the stylistic merit of the book, he's in rapture when it comes to the stylistic merit of the book. But when it comes to the contents of it, he feels that there is an agenda even for the creation of Telugu translation. And he looks at Mahabharata more or less as a static text. I hope that answers the question.
We have another question by Saurav Gupta, who wants to know more about research techniques and tools to bring out the cognitive meaning of poems.
As I mentioned earlier, I did a very preliminary reading of the verses because I'm not trained as a poet or to understand poetry. So I did it the traditional way in which verse is understood, right, which was taught for us in the Telugu classes that we had in school, was basically to break down the verse into individual words and figure out the meanings of each one of them, and then after it forms a whole, then try to understand what is the meaning of it. So that's the method that I used, and it's not an ideal method, but given my limitations, that's what I tried to do. And there are a lot of other sources. For example, if one wants to understand Mahabharata verses, there are a lot of commentaries which have very specific meanings and commentaries. So that also can be used. And I'm not very sure what it means by cognitive, but I was doing a general plain reading of the verses.
So to clarify, I think he was mentioning that he's been following the topic on Facebook, and he was saying that we need a more robust research methodology to facilitate analysis of literary elements of text and form from a communication perspective. So I think that is where his question stems from.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, but yeah. So the tools that I had were primarily that I understood from my early ways of understanding poems, using breaking it down into individual words. Yeah.
So I'm having a bit of internet trouble, and I've requested Pranay to share the drive link in chat, and he's just doing that right now. What is there in the drive link is Shashi's created a reading list, and if you could just tell us a little bit about what you've done, Shashi.
So basically, the Google Drive has a document which has all the references of the paper that I was trying to author, and I've also added a few other papers that that I was using in the course of this presentation. So those are papers that I did not mention in the talk because of the lack of time, but those are secondary readings for the, and I'll also add a couple more in the next few minutes. So basically they'll give a background to the entire presentation.
Right, perfect. So the link has just been shared in chat, and thank you so much, Shashi, for taking the time out. This is all the time that we have for today's RRTO.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope I had to rush through the thing, so I was going really fast. I hope that did not cause a lot of trouble, and thank you so much.